morning.
Everybody here, everybody we got on Pal Talk. Good morning, Curie. For everybody that just heard down the recording, that was my dog shaking, saying good morning. And then hi to everybody on YouTube. Woohoo! So it's kind of a mixture. I'm excited to be talking today. I'm really nervous to be talking today. For those of you who've been here, you know I've just been going through a lot of illness recently. And I'm still kind of like, and I might actually talk about all that, but my voice is still a little twitchy at times. So I'm just going, okay, Spirit, I'm trusting you that I got 20 minutes of voice going in me today, and we'll see how that goes. So I decided I wanted to talk about, I was like, okay, what do I do? Because for those of you, like I said, who've been here, you know, I think the last time I spoke was probably about August. So it's been over 4 months since I last was able to teach. And I thought, okay, what am I going to talk about my first time back? And I just really got the guidance to talk about some of the experience I had with it. In particular, the idea of spiritual bypass, because some people brought that up to me. And so I'm going to talk about that. But for those of you who are like, what's she talking about? How sick has she been? I actually had to write it down, because I was like, the last 2 years have been, my body has not done well. And I'm still kind of figuring it all out. I actually moved here in December 2015. So it was over 2 years ago. Woohoo! Barely a month later, I got a back injury. They never did find out what caused the back injury. They did x-rays, they did, you know, MRIs, all that stuff. They never did know what caused that back injury. And so we went from that to, they just were like, okay, we're just gonna have to medicate you because we don't know what else to do with you. Put me on really strong painkillers. And in April, I'm still on the painkillers, going down the stairs at our old location, and I fell. About 4 or 5 steps. Now, I was really grateful because I missed the glass door, but they thought I had just sprained my ankle. They said, oh, it's sprained, it's sprained. So I said, okay. So they started sending me to physical therapy. In June, so a couple months later, I was getting really tired, and they were like, well, we think it's the medication, we're not sure. So they actually ran blood tests, and it came back I had a couple of like vitamin deficiencies. So they, you know, did that. November, I ended up doing an outpatient treatment for binge eating, which I've talked about that a little bit. Like, I've always struggled with my eating, but I go through phases. And that year, I was just like, I would go home on binge. And when I say binge, like eat until I was almost sick. And so I ended up doing an outpatient treatment for that. That started in November. In December, which I'm still doing the outpatient thing, in December, I was having, you know, normal checkup for women, and they came back that one of my mammogram tests came back questionable. And so then they had to do another test to make sure I didn't have breast cancer, which ended up, it was scar tissue, but, you know, I had about 2 weeks there going, okay, I really hope, you know, my family has a history of breast cancer. We went from that to, in February, they realized they had misdiagnosed the foot, and it wasn't a sprain when I fell down the stairs, and I ended up having to have surgery on it, followed by more physical therapy. In June, they were testing for insomnia, because I was in bed like 12 hours a day, and I would sleep off and on, but I'd be awake 2-3 hours at a time. They never did come up with that. In July, I started having stomach issues. They thought it was an ulcer. They ended up deciding it's extra bile, but I would literally be in the office from like the time I got in the morning to the time I left, feeling like I was going to throw up the whole time. And it was just getting worse and worse. That kind of finally started to resolve, and then in September, I completely lost my voice. And they thought, okay, it's laryngitis, and so they went a couple weeks and said, okay, use an inhaler, it'll be laryngitis. Didn't go away. And they ended up diagnosing it as vocal cord polyps, which is basically like a callus or a blister on the vocal cord. And they said, well, you must have done something. You were at a football game screaming. I said, no. You must be a professional singer, and you were singing your heart out. No. You must have been yelling at somebody. No. Again, no clue as to why this vocal cord's developed. So I've got all these weird medical conditions, and I'm sure some people, most of you know that I'm planning on moving. This all started like when I moved to San Francisco. I've never been this sick or this badly injured ever in my life. And it suddenly happened, and I'm like, I don't know. You all say it's not the only reason. It's played a little factor in my decision to move, because it's just been crazy. It's like I can't get over one thing without getting something else. Now the last 3, the insomnia, the stomach issues, and the vocal cord polyps, the doctors just finally looked at me and said, you're stressed. Stop being stressed. Great, thanks for that advice. Stop being stressed. And then I thought about it, and it was really interesting because I did not feel like my mind was stressed. I felt like I was in a good place. I was accepting the stuff. You know, I've talked to my therapist, and he's been like, considering all the health issues you've had, you're doing really good. You know, and I felt like I was in a good place, and yet my body has been exhibiting symptoms of stress. Even though everything else in me said, you're good. And so I'm pretty open on Facebook with what's going on with my life. I'm particularly open about my doggie, who's sound asleep right now. She's being a good girl. But I share what's going on in my personal life on Facebook quite a bit. You know, family gets to follow me that way, friends, let everybody know what's going on. And I started getting messages back, you're fake. You're doing a spiritual bypass. And I got this from a few different people. And I got told, you should be more upset. Why aren't you more upset about these illnesses and injuries? And then I started getting, I got this from two people. One who, I'll say I brushed it off. The other one's a good friend, so I gave her a little more credit, but then I brushed it off. Said to me, you're having voice issues. You know what it is? You're not speaking your truth. This is all evidence that you're not speaking your truth. And I'm going, I think I'm kind of one of the more vocal people I know. You know, I pretty much say what I think. And so I had these people on Facebook started, I hate to use the word judging, but it felt like I was being judged. That I was being told, like, you're pretending, you're faking, you should be this, you should be that. And the word that kept coming to me again, I had a few people use it, was a spiritual bypass. So I decided to look it up. And I was like, what is a spiritual bypass? Because that seems to be the new trendy word in spiritual communities. Spiritual bypass, what is that? And it was interesting, it's actually from the 1980s, and although I will say the gentleman, his name's John Wellwood, is a Buddhist teacher, his main focus was actually a psychotherapist. He wasn't intending the spiritual bypass to be part of the spiritual realm. He was using it as part of his psychotherapy practice. And he said basically it's a tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. It's a pretty good definition. And what is it? It's basically, it's what I said, it's being fake. I'm going to pretend I'm spiritual. I'm putting those spiritual concepts out there. You know, people said, like, I'm in acceptance that my foot's broken. And if, for any of you saw on Facebook, at one point it was about the size of a large grapefruit, my ankle. It was huge. And people were like, you're pretending to be spiritual. You're saying you're accepting it because that's what you teach. You must be doing a spiritual bypass. And so I looked at the course. I thought, is there a purpose for spiritual bypass? Are spiritual bypasses always bad? And there's parts of the course that talks about, and part of the reading today, talked about, he points to all the gifts you have each time. The thought of a poverty oppresses you. Well, if somebody points out a gift and you're not aware you need the gift, it's not going to mean much, is it? And so there is a point, and it says, keep no source of interference from his sight, for he will not attack your sentinels. Bring them to him. Bring these things that you're using to guard yourself to Spirit, and let his gentleness teach you that in the light they are not fearful. So the Course is saying, be honest with God. How do we bring things to healing? We bring them to God. We have to be, there's one lesson that just says, I'll be honest with myself today. I'll be honest with myself. And so there is a part of us that needs to not do that spiritual bypass, that needs to say, okay, there's things in my life that need healing. I need to look at them. I shouldn't just be playing spiritual and brushing this under the rug. But the flip side is there a time when maybe we do need to bypass a little bit? And I'll say, it's interesting, I'm going to start from the psychotherapy side, and then I'm going to go to the one quote that I came up with. Why do we spiritually bypass? We spiritually bypass the same reason that I binge ate. It was a coping mechanism. There's something out there that we don't feel capable of handling. There's something that we don't feel that we have the tools at this time to address. And so we kind of escape from it. For me, it was, I said, like, I'll use the binge eating because it's big in my life. I've worked through it for years. I would go home and I was tired, and I didn't want to think about being tired. Or I was frustrated, I should have done a better job today. It's hard to think I should have done a better job today when you're just thinking, I really hope I don't have to run to the restroom and puke this up. Not to be gross, but that's how much I would eat. I would have to be focusing my whole thoughts on, I just don't want to get sick because I ate so much. And that way I could escape that other stuff that I was feeling. And the spiritual bypass is that same idea. What's interesting, like I said, this came from a psychological standpoint, from a psychotherapist, who, yes, he's a Buddhist teacher, but he was focusing on the psychotherapy. And what they've had a lot of spiritual teachers who have jumped on this bandwagon, who have said, my shtick, for lack of a better word, my shtick is I'm going to help you move past your spiritual bypasses. And what's interesting is a lot of the spiritual teachers have now had to step back and say, I'm sorry. I pushed a student when I shouldn't have. I confronted somebody with something that they weren't ready yet to deal with. And I think the Holy Spirit, it's not specifically talking about spiritual bypasses, but I'll say I feel it applies, is it says, so fearful is the dream, so seeming real, he could not wake into reality without the sweat of terror and a scream of mortal fear, unless a gentler dream preceded his awakening. To move from, I'm entrenched, I'm dug into my story, I'm in my pain, to going, boop, okay, I'm awakened, everything's perfect. It says it would cause mortal fear and a scream of terror. So the Spirit kind of does a little in-between step. A gentler dream, a happier dream. And I think the spiritual bypass can sometimes play that role. There is a certain place where you fake it till you make it. I'm in a lot of pain. If I sit here and think, my voice is going, how miserable is this? I can't believe I'm a preacher and my voice is gone. That sucks. I'm miserable. What good does that do me? But if somebody walks up to me and says, and I had this happen, you should change your mind and you'll be fine. You know what I want to say to him? Okay? Can be qualified with FU, with a few letters in between. I was like pissed. I was like, don't just tell me to change my mind. I'm not having fun being sick. I'm not having fun not being able to talk. But to go from I can't talk to, yay, it's all world and bright and shiny, wasn't going to happen. But I did able to step back and say, hold on, okay. Maybe I just need to say, I know the spiritual principles. Maybe I don't feel them at this moment. Maybe I'm looking at this like, what the heck good is coming from me not being able to talk for 3+ months? Poor Reverend Tony, we finally had to set it up on the computer so I would type, and then the computer would read it. And so that way he knew what I needed to tell him, because I couldn't communicate with my boss for 3 months. But I stood there and I said, I'm going to trust this is for my good. And there was a sense, I believed it, but at the same time, there is that point where sometimes you have to say, I know the spiritual principles in my mind, and I'm going to apply them even if I'm not wholly believing them at this moment. And I'll say one of the biggest beliefs, and sometimes people say, like I said, they were saying, well, your voice is because, you're not speaking your truth. Sometimes I think we get way too complicated about this. Guess where all illness comes from? It doesn't come from, I'm not speaking my truth. It doesn't come from, somebody said, I wasn't walking my truth, that's why I hurt my ankle. It doesn't come from, I'm binge eating because, whatever. Here comes where all illness comes from. It's the belief that I'm a body. And we tend, and I think the Course, because it was written, it was channeled through a doctor. It was channeled through somebody in the psychotherapy field. It focuses more on health and illness. I think that's because of who it was channeled through. What is the difference between the thought of I'm a body and I'm not speaking my truth? There is none. What's the difference between I'm sick and I need to eat breakfast this morning? What's the difference between I broke my ankle and I don't feel comfortable going outside with no clothing on? Guess what? There's no difference. It's all still the same belief of I'm a body. And so I think sometimes we overanalyze these things and people start, it's almost like a spiritual bypass of, guess what? You're not enlightened. That's what you're spiritually bypassing. You're spiritually bypassing, you're not enlightened yet. Maybe there's no other reason. Maybe there is. But we need to stop villainizing illness. And when somebody's being accepting of illness, because for them it's just part of the body experience, allow them to be. If they're okay with it, let them be okay with it. Like I said, I had people that were a little obnoxious to me. I don't know how else to say it. A little obnoxious at times. And two of the principles I really applied actually come from Don Miguel Ruiz, the 4 agreements. One was just don't make assumptions. One assumption is the person knows what they're talking about. There were some instances where I finally just had to go, I'm not listening to you because I don't think you know what you're talking about. You don't know the circumstances. So I had to let go of my assumptions. But then I also had to learn not to take things personally. The Course talks about, everything we see, everything we experience is a projection of our thoughts. Now I'll say, and I'm not going to get into the big metaphysical, I think there is more to it than our thoughts of the brain. Okay? I don't think the thoughts that we experience are necessarily just these thoughts. I think there's a deeper level to them. But what we are responsible for is how we react with our thoughts. And so if somebody is looking at me and they're attacking me and they're being mean and they're saying, I'm not spiritual or whatever, I can look at that person and say, I don't know why they're doing this. And you know what? It's not about me. What's about me is how I respond, how I experience what they're saying. But what they're saying, sometimes we just have to let that go and say that's their deal and let them be. The Course goes on, it says the mind that accepts attack cannot love. Look at that one, the mind that accepts attack cannot love. If I allow those people to come in and say, you're not spiritual, you're not good enough, you're not telling your truth, it shuts down my ability to be in love. And the Course says, the only judgment involved at all is the Holy Spirit's one division into 2 categories. One of love, and the other being the call for love. And you cannot safely make this division. So there's a part of me, I'll say, who looks at some of these people and goes, oh, I'm going to be the spiritual one now, right? Now here's me going to spiritual. You're not spiritual because you're being mean to me. It must be a call for love. But guess what the Course says? The Course says, you know what? I'm looking through ego. So I have to let go of that thought of like somebody who's attacking me, somebody who's saying, oh, you're in spiritual bypass. I have to let that go and just say that whether they are loving or whether they are calling for love, I have one reaction, which is I need to be loving. And so I think there is a place for feeling and expressing how we are, how we feel, what we're going through. What I don't agree with, though, is that we have to necessarily be mean about it. There's some people who will say, some people who go into the, I'm going to be authentic. So excuse me while I'm, a witch with a bee. I don't think that's what authenticity is, because what's the Course say? God is love, and therefore so am I. And you think, but I don't feel like love. Maybe I'm going through, I can't speak. My ankle's busted. My stomach's upset. I can't sleep. I can't whatever. Those emotions aren't bad. What they are, though, is to say, hey, there's something here for you to look at. And we don't need to delve into those things, but we can open our hearts and say, what is the loving response for me, for this other person who's addressing me, what is the way that I can express love in this situation? And the Course says, we allow the miracles to go through us and then we let it go. I can share love with my friend. I can share love with the people who I would not necessarily classify as friends. They're there. They're part of my experience. They're not my buddies. But I can express love. And I can say, regardless of what they said to me, I'm going to do what's loving for me, which in this case I'll say was not to take on this story that I wasn't speaking my voice. It didn't feel right to me. And so I didn't accept it. But I did say thank you to them for sharing their thoughts. I said, I appreciate you expressing your concern. And so we look at, and I love this last part of the reading, I'm going to close with this. It says, the gifts are yours, entrusted to your care to give to all who chose the lonely road you have escaped. It is you who teach them now, for you have learned of Christ there is another way for them to walk. Teach them by showing them the happiness that comes to those who feel the touch of Christ and recognize God's gifts. Let sorrow not tempt you to be unfaithful to your trust. Now it's interesting, it says we've learned, which means we have to go through it. But when we've learned, regardless of what the other people say, we can share our love, we can share our happiness with them. So thank you, that's my talk for today.